But obviously, to address scientific and technical aspects of post-accident issues, technical mediation and appropriate tools are required in order to establish a meaningful and fruitful interface between the public and technical issues and problems, and to help non-expert actors to develop their competencies to address and investigate technical issues. The use of adequate tools, similar to the ones described by Professor Raskov, to analyze the impact of different management strategies can effectively support this dialogue and help to gain trust and develop fruitful cooperation. Also, the use of technical means to characterize radiation exposure or radiation contamination of agricultural products, for instance. In framing these processes, including the stakeholders' participation in decision-making about decontamination, I think the IRPA guiding principles on stakeholder engagement could be of great help. And I would like to finish my talk by introducing these principles for your consideration. The IRPA, the International Radiation Protection Association, is an association of about 18,000 radiation protection professionals from about 60 countries all over the world. The guiding principles are a distillate of a very wide spectrum of experiences that were presented during several workshops and then discussed and analyzed. And these principles are intended to develop trust and credibility throughout the decision-making process in order to improve the sustainability of any final decision. I wouldn't read the principles that you can see in the slide, and I invite you to visit the IRPA website, where a document describing each principle and going into more details and examples is contained. However, there is one basic conclusion that I hope all of you agree, and it's that when decontamination operations are to be applied to populated areas, the complexity of the situation is far beyond the radiation protection considerations alone, and all the relevant dimensions such as health, environmental, economic, social, psychological, cultural, ethical, and political must be addressed. Quality and effective strategies should be based on dialogue and understanding between the experts, authorities, and mainly the affected stakeholders. Optimal strategies can only be those accepted by all. They should be technically sound, feasible, and effective, and allow improvement of the overall life conditions in the areas and their economic development. And this is my main message. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eduardo, explaining to us this important project of Europe, NERIS, and very useful guiding principles developed by IPRA concerning stakeholder involvement. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to request Professor Miranda Schuros, Director of the Environmental Policy Research Institute of Free University, Berlin. So, Miranda-san, please.
Minasan konnichiwa. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Skip my PowerPoints because there have been so many PowerPoints, and I just want to talk to you. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what we saw in Fukushima and what my impression was of the decontamination initiatives there. First, I'd like to say that I am impressed by the people of Fukushima who are very eager to get their lives back, and they are really trying very hard to think about the future. And the second thing I would like to say is that we don't have the answers. Nobody has the answers. There's a lot of things we don't know. We don't know so much about decontamination on the scale that is being discussed for the Fukushima region. We don't know so much about how effective it can be. And I do have a bit of a concern that there's expectation that you can decontaminate a region and bring it back to the way it was before. I don't think that's possible. I think some decontamination is possible and desirable, especially in areas where there are lots of concentrated population. And I think after seeing Fukushima, we have to think much more, or not we, but it would be useful for Japan to think much more about the relationship between decontamination and the future. To think much more about how much effort do we spend on decontaminating some regions versus maybe spending that money in terms of reconstructing the region, which already was economically in difficult situation even before Fukushima. I think in order to do that, one thing that we need is the kind of dialogue that was being talked about in some of the other presentations, but maybe not just dialogue about what is decontamination, what are the methods of decontamination, how effective is decontamination, but dialogue about how do we link discussions about decontamination and discussions about how do we bring people back to this community? Or how do we find job opportunities for the next generation? And what I liked very much about the presentations we had in the plenary session just before ours were the discussions about what can be the future for Fukushima in 10 years or in 20 years or in 30 years. And to look at some of the areas where contamination is quite high and say maybe it doesn't make so much sense to focus a lot of attention on decontamination in those areas. And to say maybe these are areas where we put big photovoltaic farms and use that as a way of saying, in the short term, decontamination is going to be so costly and maybe not necessarily so effective. Let's focus on building an image for the future. Let's make this the renewable energy region for Fukushima. And those areas that are medium contaminated, to think about, okay, do we decontaminate? How much? What other possibilities are there? And for the areas where there's lower levels of contamination, maybe those are the areas where the decontamination work should be focused on if it makes sense also in thinking about where can this region be in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. Decontaminating without a plan for the future is, in a way, it's throwing money away that could also be very useful for the people who were so heavily damaged by the tsunami and by the nuclear disaster. I think many of these ideas are already being discussed in many communities in Japan. With the very limited experiences we had in Fukushima, my impression is there could be more of such discussions about linking what can we and what can't we do with contamination, and what should we do in terms of developing a future for the region. And I think the European experiences only have limited ability to show a path because Europe hasn't been affected in the same way. It can help maybe for the future and planning for future disasters. But I do think this dialogue is also important because Europe also needs to be prepared and learn from Japan about what happens if there's another accident somewhere in the world. But I thank you all for the opportunity to even come here and talk with you about these things. Thank you.
Milano-san, thank you very much.